What's going on? Welcome to Tech with Sean. And recently I came across an older gaming laptop. It's an Acer Nitro 5 and it has a GTX 1050 3GB in it. Now this wasn't a top spec laptop. I think when this came out you could actually get the same Acer Nitro configured with up to a 2060, but this is the budget version for that year and it has an i5 9300H, which is 4 cores and 8 threads. And the factory spec was a single DIMM of 8GB of RAM, but I've upgraded it to two 8GB, so we have 16 gigs in dual channel. And I also dropped in an extra SSD just so I wouldn't have to uninstall, reinstall a bunch of stuff to try it out. It wasn't the top spec, but it seems to be really popular because I looked up this model and on Best Buy's website it had over 700 reviews, which is kind of a lot for their site. So maybe this was one of their Black Friday deals like a few years ago or something, but anyways, I just had it on hand, and so I wanted to see how this 3GB 1050 held up in some games here in 2023 going into 2024. It's dirt cheap. I wouldn't pay more than like $100 or $2 for this laptop because at this point in time, if you're trying to spend $400 or $500, you can actually get something pretty decent with like a 4050 or 3050 probably. But the 1050, it exists. There's a good amount of these laptops out there. Maybe you have one and you're interested to see if it's still worth, playing on, or you're looking at one and you're gonna get a crazy deal on it. So either way, let's take a look at this thing and see how it performs in some games today. Okay, the first game we're checking out is Forza Horizon 5, and we're running this at 1080p with TAA anti-aliasing on some very low settings, and we're going to try to get 60 frames per second. You can see we are actually getting 60 for this. It is pushing the GPU up to 80 to 90% utilization, but we are getting 60 frames per second here on the 3GB 1050. So pretty impressed. This is a fairly well optimized game, but it's still nice to be able to get full frames in a AAA game like this. Next up we got Horizon Zero Dawn. We're running this at 1080p on the Favor Performance preset, and you can see we can almost get 60 frames per second. It does have some dips, and while this is pretty playable still, I will say it's very ugly on these low settings. There's a lot of aliasing and it just doesn't look like as good as it could. That said, you can get a playable experience, it looks like, here on the 1050. Next up, Skyrim Special Edition, and here we're running on a medium preset, I believe, at 1080p, and it's getting just under 60 frames per second. There's a few dips here and there. It is a lot better than if you played it on a console at 30 frames per second, but it does have a little bit of some hiccups. The 1050 is the bottleneck here. You could lower some more settings or drop resolution or maybe even play the non-special edition of Skyrim if you needed the full 60, but I think this is a playable experience. Next up is Dragon Quest XI's, and we're running this with the anti-aliasing on 4 out of 6 and the post-processing and shadow quality on 2 out of 3. And at 1080p native resolution, this game doesn't have upscaling or anything like that. We're able to get 60 frames per second. Now the reason I'm targeting 60 frames per second in most of these games is that this is a 60 Hz display on here, and really on something this old I think you're just going to be happy to be able to play games at 60 frames per second. I don't think that you're going to be trying to push a high refresh rate experience or anything like that on this old Acer Nitro 5. This game looks really good though with some settings turned down. It's just slightly not as good anti-aliasing and shadows and stuff, but the art style still holds up, the gameplay is still pretty smooth, and it looks good. If you're a fan of old school RPGs and you haven't tried Dragon Quest XI's, I definitely recommend it. Next up we got GTA 5, and we're running this at 1080p on a mix of like medium and high settings. And we're getting 60 frames per second here as Trevor walking around starting some trouble. There are going to be some instances where you're going to have frame dips playing this game when there's a lot of traffic and stuff going on, but I think that it's definitely still playable. You're getting 60 a majority of the time. It looks pretty decent at these settings, and this is a really well optimized game. You can run GTA 5 on a wide variety of hardware, and this 1050 is ample for playing it. If you had a better card, you could turn everything up, run MSAA, do some different stuff. You could use higher resolutions and whatnot, but for playing it on this machine on the built-in screen, I think the 1050 still does a quite good job. It is an older game now though, so it's not that far of a stretch, but it's still impressive just given how big the open world is and everything like that. Next up, also from Rockstar Games, we've got Red Dead Redemption 2, and we're running this on some pretty low settings. This is not too far off probably from what the console specs would have been. And to get a good playable experience in this game, I found it was best to use Rivatuner and limit the FPS to 30 frames per second. It will play at a little higher than 30, but it bounces around a lot and it's under 60, and by locking it to 30, it makes the gameplay experience itself just much smoother. This is probably on par with what you'd get playing it on like a PS4 or an Xbox or whatever, so it's definitely a playable experience, and I was kind of surprised that the old 3GB 1050 managed so well in this game. It still looks really good. It's not the most fast-paced game, and a lot of people did play it at 30 FPS on the console, so you could definitely go through the game like this if you wanted to. Next up, we got a real test for it. Here we got Cyberpunk 2077, one of the more hard-to-run games that's out right now. And we're going to run this at 1080p. We're going to start with the low settings, go through, turn off some stuff, turn off motion blur, and we're going to give this the best possible chance that it can have. Getting into the benchmark here, it's near 30 frames per second all the time. There are some dips under 30 FPS, and then once you get outside of the bar, the FPS picks up a little bit. But it's not the best experience, I will say. It's probably better than it would be on a console. I've heard that the Cyberpunk experience on console is not that great. So if you wanted to, if I were playing this on here, I'd use these really low settings, and then just like in Red Dead 2, I would use Rivatuner to lock it to 30 frames per second. And that's probably going to end up feeling much more stable as you're walking around and panning the camera and stuff. Even though it's not the ideal 60 FPS that we'd like to get as PC gamers, getting 30 FPS in a kind of stable fashion is going to be better than an inconsistent 35 to 40 FPS or something like that. But it will run Cyberpunk 2077, so that's kind of impressive. Alright, now we're really going to put the hurt on this 1050 3GB. We're loading up Starfield, we're on the low settings, and we have the render resolution turned all the way down to 50%, so effectively this is going to be rendering at 540p and doubling that up to 1080p. And here we are on some sort of base or ship of some sort, taking on some Varun zealots, and we're getting between 35 and 45 or so frames per second, which is somewhat playable. It is better than what you'd get on a console, but it is inconsistent as usual. And these types of areas are a little bit easier to run, for the game engine than in the bigger cities where you have a lot more people and stuff going on. These are tighter spaces with only a few characters being rendered at a time. So let's go ahead and jump into a more urban area and see how this 1050 performs. And now that we're in a city, you can see that we are having some troubles maintaining that 30 FPS. It's dropping down into the 20s. It is getting a little inconsistent, and the graphics are noticeably bad in this city. Everything's just blocky, low resolution looking, very aliased. And part of the reason I think that Starfield is impressive and fun to play in the first place is the graphics and the worlds and exploring how cool this stuff looks. And so I think taking such a big hit to the resolution and the graphics settings really hurts the presentation of the game. And combine that with this low frame rate, and I think this is just not going to be a very good Starfield experience. It will technically run, but I don't think that this is how anybody really wants to go through the game. Alright, so overall I would say it was an okay-ish gaming experience. Older games were no problem. Esports games, you can play those. It did, meet its match at some newer stuff like Starfield. I would not really choose to play that on here probably. That's maybe the one game I would just pass on if I was using this GPU. But even some more demanding newer games like Cyberpunk or Red Dead 2, those were kind of playable, especially if you don't mind locking them to a console-like 30 frames per second. For what it's worth, I was recording using NVIDIA Shadowplay, and so you may be able to scrape out a couple more frames per second if you are not recording your screen. That said, it's still a functional laptop, and that 1053GB will still play almost everything at acceptable settings except for the latest and greatest games. So if you just want something to kick around on and play some older games, or just mess around with, maybe it's worth checking out. But I just happened to have this on hand and wanted to see how it performed in some newer-ish games. But any computer is better than no computer, so if you got one of these, you can still play a decent amount of stuff on it. Thanks for watching along. I hope this was helpful or at least entertaining. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.